be reviewing Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit today, an intro to consciousness and the dialectic specifically related to the subject achieving consciousness and then self-consciousness. So to start off, I have a question for y'all. What would y'all define as consciousness? What would y'all define as self-consciousness? Are there stages to that? Any input from y'all?
No.
Anyone else might think, any idea what consciousness is? Raise your hand. Yeah?
I mean, I guess consciousness would just be like, just like a general like kind of awareness of like your surroundings, like the fact that like you exist. I guess it's more just about like what your situation, like just awareness of your situation, kind of your surroundings, I guess.
Okay, yeah. So
I guess awareness of like yourself, like somewhat about how you as an organism functions, and something about like.
Yeah, so that's kind of getting towards it. Do you imagine stages of consciousness or no? Or, yeah.
I think so.
Stages of consciousness. How would we delineate those stages?
Yeah.
How would those be divided, do you think?
Okay, I think there's a pre-memory and post-memory stage. Like pre-memory would be like when you're like 1, 2, 3 or something like that. You can't really form memories because I guess your brain is not developed enough to recognize previous things. But post-memory, we like become more aware of our surroundings. We become morality, stuff like that.
Okay, so Hegel doesn't define consciousness vis-a-vis memory. You have an idea?
Oh yeah, I was thinking there's like different levels of consciousness. There's like there's consciousness of a rock, for example, which is essentially nothing. There's consciousness of an animal, which is slightly below the.
Okay, that's separate. We went over that before. Okay, no. Oh yeah.
But I would think that I mean, I kind of have a more broad definition of just like general consciousness, but I feel like it's like I agree that there's obviously stages. I would say like just being able to just like have some sort of awareness of surroundings and responding to stimuli is basically like a basic level of consciousness, and then like more complex development or understanding about how I guess your like the brain functions work and things like that is a more higher level of consciousness.
Okay, so kind of, but Hegel defines those things that you lump together, awareness of yourself and others, as existing on two different sort of levels or stages of consciousness. The first would be, I'll just draw someone here. I'll draw some soul or whatever. So this is the being in itself initially. The being in itself is the initial form. They understand themselves to an elementary level. They have an idea of what their essence is, but they don't recognize their finitude. This is the outside world, which pushes back on this being. And once the outside world is realized, you realize your finitude, which is Hegel's explanation of limits, your limitations. And so to start off my explanation of the difference between consciousness and self-consciousness, so I'll write C for consciousness, correlating with being in itself, understanding its own essence without the finitude of itself and the relation of the non-I vis-a-vis the I. And there's self-consciousness, which is counterintuitively defined as being for itself, or at least counterintuitively at first defined that way. And so I'll read the quote to help us better understand the end result of that. And that quote is, what is it? With this, and the this in here is being the movement of notion. But with this, the phenomenology of spirit is concluded. What spirit prepares for itself in it, the element of true knowing, in this element, the moment of spirit now spreads themselves out in that form of simplicity, which knows its object as its own knowing, but remain in the simple oneness of knowing. They are the true in the form of the true, and their difference is only the difference of content. Their movement, which organizes itself in this element as a whole, is logic or speculative philosophy. Okay, so what does that mean? So to start off, we have to define a few terms that I just explained. First, we'll be defining the true, the notion, and the absolute. And so I'll write those down. the true, the notion, and the absolute. And these are technical terms in phenomenology of spirit, so I will be using them as such. There's a quote that defines what the true is here. Let me pull it up real quick. And that quote is, "The true is the whole, but the whole is nothing other than the essence consummating itself through its development. Of the absolute, it must be said that it is essentially a result, that only in its end is what it truly is, and that precisely in this consists its nature, viz. To be actual subject, the spontaneous becoming of itself." Okay? So, the true would be the whole. So, we write that down here. The whole. And by the whole, we mean everything. The true is not just the individual I or the subject, it is everything in its entire capacity. And then the absolute is the end point of the true. So the absolute is the final product / stage of the dialectical progression of the notion. And then what's the notion? The notion is the fact of this dialectical progression. And so we can define the notion then as the process of essentially spirit becoming. The process of us going from the simple notion to the absolute. And so here we have to have an elementary understanding of Hegel's idea of the dialectic. Hegel was most famous for the idea of the dialectic, so we'll describe this here using the terms of the true, the notion, and the absolute. Does anyone understand what the dialectic is? I want to give it a shot. I think we went over this in previous lectures, but if you want to give any feedback, any ideas, so I understand where you're all coming from. Okay, fine. I'll go over it again real quick then. The dialectic, let's see. I'll draw the dialectic here, an idea of it. So the dialectic is pretty simple. All it says is that there's a thesis, there's an antithesis, and using this, there is a clash / contradiction between the thesis and the antithesis, which oppose each other, which result in synthesis, the essentially solution. That's how innovation occurs according to Hegel. An example of this, I don't know, I think I went over this in previous lectures, but an example might be thesis, capitalism is bad. Antithesis, communism / Marxism is bad. Synthesis, some form of social democracy is good. Both forms in their extreme are bad. Something that reconciles the two. And so Hegel says that there's a fundamental, more spiritual, and by the word spiritual, I'm using it technically, not in terms of like the soul or anything, but spirit as in relation to spirit, which is the abstracted form of subject. And subject, by the way, here, I'll define this here also. The subject is the practical element of the being, right? And then spirit here would be the abstracted, everlasting element of being. Okay? And so Hegel, yeah?
Does spirit have a determined location?
No.
Okay.
So Hegel says that when we first come into the world, we have a simple notion. And that simple notion is the elementary concept of self. It is being in itself. And that being only understands the I, which is the self. This is the I. And then this, all this, is the non-I. And so at first, we only understand the self, that's the I, that's being in itself. But then that spirit, or that simple notion, comes to contradict with the true, with knowledge essentially. And so Hegel defines this contradiction over here, which is, wait, let me pull it up real quick. Hegel defines this contradiction as spirit is this power only by looking the negative in the face and tarrying with it. This tarrying with the negative is the magical power that converts it into being. And into being meaning not into being qua being, but being for itself, through the process of being, essentially, through the process of becoming, through the process of the notion. And so what that says is the process of negation is the negation of knowledge and the simple notion. And I'm going to write this down because that's another technical term. Simple notion is the first stage of essentially consciousness, elementary, elementary grasping with knowledge. Not get tarrying with it, but grasping at it and trying to understand and initially reconcile with it. You had a question?
I wasn't exactly sure what you meant, but you said that I guess you mean like a new organism coming to like, the world or whatever, but you're saying that they understand self first and then they have like external like stimuli, external like, interactions. So you're saying like, can you clarify that a bit more? Are you saying that like a baby when they're first like develop like their first like they kind of have a good understanding that they are a certain of what they are before they experience things, or like I wasn't exactly clear about that.
Yeah, Hegel says that we all come into the world with some kind of intuitive understanding of the I. Even if it's not a complex understanding, even if we don't understand what the I's intricacies are, we understand that there's some kind of self. But in later stages of the progression of the notion, we will come to understand the I's finitude, the outer boundaries of the I, and those outer boundaries, as seen here, will become more contextualized. There will become ridges in them. And the necessary process of dialectical progression from being in itself to being for itself, and that process of the notion is what gives definition to that outer boundary of the I. And that finitude of the I. Yeah?
I mean, I'm not exactly sure that like I mean a baby or whatever, or a baby or any organism that's first.
I'm not talking about this in a sense of psychological development or biology, but I see your argument. The counter argument to Hegel would be that, sure, maybe a toddler knows that there is the non-I and they know that the non-I is different than the I. You have a lot of this in Lacanian psychoanalysis, and this is probably going to develop around 6 months or so. But Hegel says that that definition doesn't come into play until you have that tarrying with the negative, right?
But I feel like almost they kind of understand the outside world like almost before they understand yourself, right?
Well, what do you mean by understanding yourself?
Like, I mean, okay, so like, if you think about a lot of organisms are just kind of, they're governed by just like, they're first like experiencing a lot of like sensory detail about their surroundings, and a lot of things like, I don't really, but it's not exactly like you have like a good, I feel like you don't really get a good understanding of yourself until you really understand the things around you and see how it's different, right? Like you don't really.
Well, that's exactly Hegel's argument. If you don't understand yourself until you understand the world around you and you see how you're different from those other selves, that is negation, that is the outer boundary. The outer boundary is used to define the I, and the I becomes more perfect or more conclusive, and that spirit is more well defined once you have that tarrying with the negative. So the I initially is a loosely defined concept of what self is, until you have tarrying with the non-I, right? Yeah. And so Hegel describes this process of self-consciousness becoming very well. Let me get to that. He describes it is no longer existence, and it being spirit, by the way, or the simple notion. It is no longer existence in the form of being in itself, neither still in the original form of an abstract concept, nor submerged in existence, but is now the recollected in itself, ready for conversion into the form of being for self. how this is done must be described more precisely. He goes on to describe it, he goes on to describe the terrain. But here I'm going to introduce a third term between these two, and this is the transition term. So I'll just write it here, transition, which might be recollected for itself. I believe it's for itself. It could be in itself. Oh, sorry, yeah. Recollected in itself. Okay? And so when we have the thesis and the antithesis, I'm going to describe this here as the simple notion. And then this might be knowledge, so we'll write K, coming to form absolute. And so chapter 4 of Phenomenology of Spirit says that this necessarily results in an unhappy consciousness. Along the way, you have that recollected in itself, which is not fully or closely defined the absolute, and that recollected in itself becomes unhappy consciousness. And so I'll write that as another term right here. It's a technical term, so I'll use it as such again, consciousness. Anyone have any idea of what unhappy consciousness might be? Yeah?
I'm between like negativity and the emotional negativity, or just like an unawareness.
It causes emotional distress, and that cause has to do with, to a degree, lack of awareness, but actually awareness in itself. So the recollected in itself has the unhappy consciousness, which we'll define as transition state, characterized by anguish and discomfort. Because in this sense, the I is being constantly negated, and so you have two split concepts of the self. So you have the I, and you have the simple notion, which is now evolving and having to reconcile with everything outside of the I, the non-I, which is used eventually as a beneficial process because it creates those ridges and complexities of finitude so that the I can better understand its complex relations vis-a-vis the true, or rather once it achieves the absolute, the true. But to do that, it has to go through the unhappy consciousness, which is a split between the simple notion, which is evolving, and knowledge, which negates the I. And so until those splits are reconciled, you have essentially two parts of the subject. One, which is trying on the end of knowledge to understand the world through science. Science is also a technical term. I'll write that here. Science is it's just philosophical reason slash logic, I guess. It's not necessarily sciences in the natural sciences, how we usually think of it. But until the pillars of science through knowledge are reconciled with the notion, we don't have the absolute, and so we have a lack of absolute, thus resulting in an unhappy consciousness and those feelings of despair, dread, anguish, etc. You had a question?
No, so it's basically just like you're aware of like issues and limitations, you don't really have like solutions and ways you can deal with them yet until you can like reconcile it.
Yeah, Yuri, can you check the camera by the way?
Which then I guess there probably is like multiple like cycles of this happening back and forth. Like you have like you realize like limitations or issues, you figure out ways to reconcile them, and then you find more ones. So there's just a cycle, you feel unhappy, and then like satisfy consciousness.
Exactly. You got it. Do you remember that first quote at the beginning of the lecture that I opened up with, where it exactly said, in this element, the moments of spirit now spread themselves out in that form of simplicity which knows its object as its own self. That form of self is the absolute, and it is spreading itself out through that negation. It is further defining that finitude, which is not ever achieved in all aspects of life. There is never an absolute that is definitively achieved. It just gets closer and closer. So the unhappy consciousness becomes more before, but rather say that he's using an abstract a priori approach to find those things. Okay, so this is essentially a beautiful process. I think I read the quote at the beginning, and a lot of you, since I hadn't defined these terms at the start, it might have been confusing, but I think Sam has shown that we can see how this model of dialectical progression with the notion can be applied not only to that reconciliation of the absolute self or the absolute I vis-a-vis the non-I, but rather us in general and how spirit evolves and is a constantly perpetuous machine of, I guess, motion that feels out the world, grasps the world, and tarries with it to have that finitude become defined, right? I guess last thing, I should probably define, well, actually there are a few things. Next lecture, we'll be going over being qua being and what it means for being to exist in general. We haven't defined that yet. And then we'll be also going over particularity, universality, and how those two form a dialectic to form the individual and what that individual is, which is another aspect of the dialectic that we haven't covered yet, making it more of a three-dimensional model. So that'll be exciting in Hegel Part 2, I guess. In the meantime, does anyone have any other questions about the phenomenology of spirit? Okay, perfect then. Glad you all enjoyed the lecture. As you see, the quote I introduced at the beginning turned out to be beautiful, and I guess Part 2, it'll become even more so.